Hello again, it's Rick Partlow from How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. And today I'm going to talk to you about weapons. Now, for military science fiction, weapons are the bread and butter. They're the thing that writers spend way too much time describing in loving detail. And don't get me wrong, you need to have that detail about your weapons, but you don't need to share it all. That's the thing about writing, especially military science fiction. We come up with all these fake factoids. We build all these complex weapon systems, but we don't need to share everything about them. The important thing when you're using weapons in science fiction, military science fiction in particular, is verisimilitude. I've used that word several times in these videos, and I'm sure most of you know what it means, but in this sense, the meaning that I'm going for is it's not necessarily real or even realistic or practical. It has the air of realism. It has to feel real to the people reading the book. It has to feel like something that, yes, this is something that feels real to me, that feels like it would be developed and used. So, for example, if you say they're carrying a laser, that doesn't feel real. That feels science fiction-y. Now, in my Earth at War series, the aliens who bring us into their alliance do use laser weapons, but it's made clear that they use those laser weapons because they're not experienced militarily and they have no sense of tactics or strategy, so they just use something they know works as a weapon because they've used it as a tool. And it's brought up in the series. This is a horrible military weapon because it has a high thermal signature. People can just follow it in like a searchlight and you'll be dead. And the only reason that the bad guys use it is because they stole it from our allies who didn't know anything about war. So you want something that's going to feel real. Let's start with infantry weapons, because my bread and butter is the ground pounder. That's what I write mostly. I have some fleet action in my books, but mostly it's about Marines or Rangers or infantry. It's people on the ground, in the dirt, getting shot at and shooting back. There's nothing wrong, and a lot of authors have done this, with just having a conventional slug-firing rifle. It's simple. You don't have to explain the technology of it to the reader. It's effective, and even in the future, it will probably still be effective. There'll be improvements, but you don't have to go into those, because when a soldier is shooting his M16, unless you're writing a period piece with a guy who used to have an M14 in Vietnam and is like, I don't like this new M16, he's not thinking about, the M16 has an improved rate of fire, it's a lighter weapon, it's more plastic involved, it's got a modular design. He's not thinking any of that shit. He's thinking, this thing sucks to clean. I wish I had an AK-47. Maybe he's thinking that. But you can use just your regular slug shooting assault rifle, that people have been using since World War II, and call it something whiz-bang, and it'll work fine. But, a lot of people who get into military science fiction, they don't do it because the money's better, because it's frankly not for most people. They don't do it because it's a genre that, is not crowded with authors, because it is, frankly. They get into military science fiction because they like the whiz-bang stuff. They like, coming up with new technologies and it's like an RPG or a strategy computer game. You come up with a setting, a world, and you want to build it. That's half the fun of writing science fiction in general. And military science fiction has an added benefit of you have to take all this technology and this technological base you've invented and then throw it into a war and come up with tactics for it. So it is pretty much geek paradise. So there is a strong temptation to use something more complicated. I have never been one to stand up to temptation that long. So I definitely indulge in this. But I try to keep in mind when I do that everything that I write and invent as a weapon has to have the sense, the feeling to the reader that it could be used in real combat and wouldn't be just a piece of junk that would break the first time you use it. So lasers, for me, I have laser weapons in my book, but they are not an infantry weapon. They're not something used by the grunts. They're not something used by people who are actually fighting on the ground. They are mostly used for people who are in the whatever you call it. I call it the space fleet. People who are like in orbit in ships. They use them for defensive weapons in case they're boarded or have to deal with something out in zero gravity, microgravity, or free fall, if you want to be technical. They use it because there's no recoil to it, and you don't have to set up some complicated recoil compensation system with a jet on your back that shoots one way when you shoot the gun the other way. So I do use lasers for that, but for people on the ground, I mostly used electromagnetically launched projectile weapons. I call them Gauss rifles. Other people call them other things. There's other books where I call them KE rifles for kinetic energy. People call them different things in different books, but Gauss rifle is a long-time genre trope standard. And they have the benefit of having a practicality to them. They're shooting a slug, a really, really big, high-speed slug at the bad guy, and shooting a slug at the bad guy has been proven to work. So if you can shoot a bigger slug faster, then that's even better. There's other things that you can do to make electromagnetically based weapons more cool and flashy. One thing that I'm fond of, and I have no idea if this would work in real life, but it sounds like it would work. And that's what's important when you're writing science fiction. Not whether something would work. As long as it doesn't break the laws of physics unknowingly, the important part is that people who are reading your book think it could work. So something that sounds cool and exotic and that a lot of people don't do, which is why I do it, is using an electromagnetically based weapon, a Gauss rifle or a coil gun or whatever you want to call it, to launch a discarding metal sabot, or it might be sabot. I've never really settled on the pronunciation of that. That's full of metal powder, like metallic hydrogen powder, in a lot of cases, and at the base of it is a small thermal charge. So when this thing fires, it starts going out at hypersonic velocities. The sabot falls away, the charge goes off, and you wind up with a burst of plasma of burning metal, basically. And a lot of the stories that I write, this is like this is not a function of the weapon, it's a function of the round you fire through it. So you could have a Gauss rifle that shoots solid penetrators when you're going up against armor, and if you're going up against lightly armored or unarmored infantry or something like that, then you load up incendiary rounds, sometimes I call them, or plasma rounds, and you shoot this, and it visually, you don't see it in the book obviously, but the visualization of it is cool. It's very Star Warsian, the line of white fire that's going slower than light. So it actually would perform a lot like the plasma I mean, the plasma from these guns would perform a lot like the blaster bolts you see in Star Wars. They're traveling along, like a bullet-like speed. And it's something that I started to do when I was much younger and got into science fiction and still loved Star Wars and other movies like that. I tried to come up with realistic, or at least realistic sounding, technological reasons why this stuff would work. And to me, that's half the fun of writing science fiction in the first place, is taking things that look cool and trying to make them realistic sounding. The plot and the characters, that's how you write a good book. That's universal to all books, all fiction books. But making cool looking stuff sound realistic it's the neat part of writing my genre. It's what I love about writing science fiction. So, a lot of readers will be familiar with Gauss rifles. They will appreciate that you've chosen something, for lack of a better word, tropey, because tropes are there because people like them. People expect them. So that will be something that they expect and they appreciate. If you add something like those plasma rounds, it's a cool little extra that they didn't expect, but it's the same but a little different, which is what everybody wants. When you're writing fiction, what people want, despite their denials, despite what the awards say, the sales say, the money says, people want the same, just a little different. So, now I want to deal with something that's kind of the bane of the existence of science fiction writers, particularly space marine writers, and that's armed drones. Right now, we have a military that's becoming more and more dependent on armed drones. And they're coming up with different sorts of armed drones, not just the flying kind. Now we're coming up with, these robots that can go along on treads and carry machine guns, and it's going to go through a phase where these are de rigueur, that they're going to be in every war. They're going to get more and more involved. You're going to have more armed drones, and eventually, as sure as the sun rises in the east, somebody is going to make an autonomous armed drone, one that you don't have to worry about losing the signal or somebody hijacking your signal, because the drone thinks for itself and you program it. This is what you shoot. If you see this, you shoot it. And that, I don't want this to sound bloodthirsty, but it takes the fun out of reading about war. Why people read military science fiction isn't just the tech. They want to read about people thrust into dangerous situations and how they deal with the stress of combat, how they deal with love and loss and death and fear and panic. And you can't do that when you're having a robot do all your shooting. You need to have people with their lives on the line. So you have to, as a writer, come up with a reason why you don't have autonomous armed drones. And I prefer no armed drones whatsoever. Now, maybe it's not realistic, but people don't, in my experience, people don't want to read about armed drones. They don't want to read about some guy sitting, 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles away, controlling an armed drone remotely. And they sure don't want to read about an autonomous armed drone unless it gets its own artificial intelligence and you have like a bolo like Keith Laumer. So, in my books, all of them, I have reasons why neither side uses armed drones. Now, it's possible you want your enemy to use them, so you can have your guys blow up, millions and millions of bag soldiers that are not real people. They're just armed drones, like they're Cylons from Battlestar Galactica. the original one, not the new one. And that way you don't have to deal with the morality of killing stormtroopers who might be, recruited as child slave labor like they were in the new movies. But I don't like that either. I like, there's something about one man or sentient being going up against another in combat that is more visceral and makes the book more interesting, more involving. So I don't like that, and I come up with reasons why neither side uses it. In my Birthright universe, which includes Glory Boy, the Birthright trilogy, Recon, the 4-book Recon series, Acheron, 4-book Acheron series, and Drop Trooper, which is, I'm just about to finish book 7. In those series, for the humans, for the human commonwealth, there was, in the history of it, there was World War III happened, but it didn't involve the US. It was China and Russia fighting each other. And after the nuclear war between China and Russia, there was as you can imagine, a huge crisis. And refugees were pouring out of the edges of Russian territory, were trying to get away from famine and death and radioactivity from the nuclear weapons. And they were pouring into Eastern and Western Europe, and the people there couldn't handle the refugees. So they set up barriers, they set up trenches, they set up walls, and they didn't have enough soldiers to man them all, or guards, because everybody was dealing with, the effects on the environment and their economy of the nuclear war. So they set up autonomous armed, robots to man these walls. And these robots killed tens and hundreds of thousands of refugees without anybody there to take the blame for it or take responsibility for it. So not only in the new government were autonomous armed drones outlawed, but they also have a societal abhorrence to them that's been instilled in people. Just the concept of it is something that not only would get you thrown in jail, but would get you looked upon like a child molester, basically. I mean, you're the lowest scum on the earth, and people would feel justified in doing any bad thing to you because it's like a taboo. It's a social taboo now. 200 years later, 200 or 300 years later, it's considered one of the worst things you can do. So that took care of the Earth. And the aliens, it was easier. The aliens, I had already established, they have a religion that considers them like an extension of their Holy Spirit, for lack of a better word. Their emperor is considered a vessel for the spirit emperor, who's part of like a spirit realm that's the land of the gods that reaches into their mortal bodies. So as a result of this, they don't use any sort of bioengineering. They don't use genetic engineering. They don't have extended lifespan like humans do. They don't do any like attempted germ warfare, which would have also complicated the war, and I didn't want to get into it. So that was good that I was able to rule that out by their religion. But one of the oddities of their religion is that life and death are the choice of their God, and they are extensions of their God. So only the living hand of a living being is allowed to deal out death, which means there has to be a living mind making the choice to kill the enemy, either another Tawny or a human. So no autonomous drones. In fact, they don't even use mines. They use remotely detonated mines, but they don't use mines that you just leave buried in a field or floating in space, because that's not a human mind making the choice to kill this other person. That's luck. That's circumstance. They don't do that. So that took care of the enemy and us in that series, and I was very happy to come up with a good reason. Then I had to come up with another one for the Earth at War series, because I didn't want to do autonomous armed drones. So humans in that series are recruited by these advanced but peaceful aliens who are being systematically defeated and dispatched by another band of humans that were taken off of Earth tens of thousands of years ago and transplanted to another world. And they get the humans, the bad humans, the Tavinians, they get their technology from the good aliens, the Helta. And the Helta are very peaceful and don't know much about war, so they didn't make any armed drones. And they find the whole concept abhorrent, the idea of building a robot to kill people. So they don't do it, and we don't have the technology for it, and they won't give it to us because they consider it, and we wouldn't do it if they did, because we don't want to piss them off. So that took care of armed drones and the like in that series. And it gets more and more complicated trying to come up with good reasons in every series why we don't have them, but I don't like them. I don't like what they do to a story. I don't recommend them for your story. Not that you can, I'm sure you can do something literarily, is that a word? Something that sounds good on a literary basis if you're a talented author, but I don't like them on a gut level, and I won't read a book about them unless it's a really good book about an autonomous armed drone that thinks for itself and has a character in its own right. Otherwise, I am not interested. I don't want to see faceless armies of armed drones. I don't care about it. There's no emotional involvement, and I don't want to read about it, and I definitely don't want to write about it. Okay, so that takes care of armed drones. Anything else for, oh yes. There's a couple of things in ground combat that may or may not be realistic. In some cases, they're totally unrealistic, but they're cool. And when you're writing military science fiction, the rule of cool trumps almost everything. And those are Battlesuits and Mecha. Battlesuits are more realistic. We're going to have powered armor, powered exoskeletons. We've already developed the actual technology for the powered exoskeleton. The only thing we're lacking is a power source that's small and light enough to fit on the armor that can power them. Right now, when we test them, we have to plug them into a wall, which isn't really going to work in combat. But at some point, we are going to come up with a power source that is light enough and powerful enough to power powered armor. And then we're going to have powered exoskeletons. But battlesuits are a step up from powered armor. Powered armor, as a rule, is about the size of a human being. It's 2 meters tall, maybe a few hundred pounds. It allows you to carry more armor, more gear, and a heavier weapon. Battlesuits are Starship Troopers. They're usually around 3 meters tall, 3 or 4. They're still something you wear, you climb into and wear like a suit, and they're human shaped. But they are more powerful, they're more mobile. Usually they have their own jets that allow them to hop, fly short distances, or be dropped from a drop ship and go to the ground, on their own jet power. They have heavier weapons, missiles. They usually have some kind of a small reactor that powers them. And I don't know if we'll ever have battlesuits. They are a regular appearing trope in a lot of military science fiction. They're cool, and as I said, the rule of cool, supersedes everything else. So I think battlesuits are something that if you don't have in your military science fiction, you need to explain why. Not because there's there's no good not because there's no good technological reason why they might not exist. You can come up with a lot of reasons why they wouldn't have happened, but you need to explain it because people will be expecting it. And if you don't have them and your tech level is such that you would, a lot of readers are going to be thinking, why doesn't he have battlesuits? So explain, that they don't have a power source that could power something that big, or it's considered not economically feasible, something. And then there's mecha. Those you do not have to explain why you don't have, because they are not practical in the least. Mecha are, for those who don't know, and I'm sure everybody watching this does, if you read any BattleTech or played the BattleTech games, mecha are basically anthropomorphic tanks. They are tanks that walk around on legs and have arms, and they're ridiculous. Technologically speaking, they're ridiculous. There may come a time where people field these things briefly, but basically you turn a tank into a big, tall target. And if you had the technology to make that big and tall of a target impervious to the weapons that will be brought to bear on it, then you would just make a tank that had that kind of defenses, and you wouldn't put a tank up on two legs. It's ridiculous. There's no reason for it. I have come up with a reason for them to be used as artillery pieces, because it seems to me that there would be a use for a walking artillery piece that is not meant to go into battle, up against armor or anything. It just hangs back behind the lines and shoots artillery, and you walk it out because, it can go through rougher terrain than a wheeled vehicle carrying that kind of weight. And you probably won't get that kind of weight onto any kind of a hovercraft. So a walking artillery piece, I think, makes some sort of sense. But a walking tank that is meant to take the place of tanks, of armor, and of mobile infantry, it makes no sense, but it is so freaking cool. So if you want to have these things in your books, people want to read about them. I wrote 2 different series about mecha, and 2 different types of mecha. In my Wholesale Slaughter series, the mecha are, I have to explain it because I'm too detail oriented not to explain why these things actually work. So I explained that there was a point in history where briefly the technology for defense had balanced the technology for attack to where mecha made sense, that you could have something that big that no infantry weapon could touch, that had the right kind of electronic countermeasures to defeat incoming guided missiles from anti-armor missiles from smaller vehicles or people carrying them, man-carried ones. And then there was this huge war, and civilization collapsed, and the technology was frozen at that level, and nobody knew how to make the better technology anymore, which is the only reason mech were still around. And, the problem I have with it, and I would eventually have if I continued with that series, is that level of technology is not going to last very long. So you're going to come up with somebody who has an infantry weapon that'll take out a mech, and once that happens, mechs are nothing but big targets, once that spreads. So, but you can come up with reasons why that you could have mechs, plausible reasons, and anyway, ones that sound good if they're not really plausible. And I love mechs. They are so awesome to read about, to visualize. So if you want mechs, you go ahead and have mechs, but realize that there is not any feasible realistic, pragmatic way that mechs make sense. The other book that I wrote about mechs, they did not take the place of tanks or infantry. They took the place of basically attack helicopters. They're basically tanks combined with attack helicopters. They're lighter. That was the Broken Arrow Mercenary Force trilogy that I wrote with Drew Avery. It's a good friend of mine, and he came up with this idea for a post-World War III world where the Russians and the US and China have basically wrecked each other, and they fight now through small commando units and guerrilla units and special forces units. And you can't transport tanks anymore because any ship that goes across the ocean is going to get blown up. A lot of the aircraft will just get blown out of the sky if you even have aircraft because everything's collapsed. But they can make these mechs, and the mechs are very mobile and can fly short distances, and you can transport them easily. So these are the de facto weapon of the post-collapse struggle. And I thought that was a cool idea for keeping the mechs plausible. So, I mean, you can come up with different reasons why mechs work. You just have to keep in mind that you will have to come up with a good reason for them. If you write them without a good reason, if you'd say, well, they're just what we have, then you're writing Battletech. And Battletech's already been written. I mean, you could do that. I mean, people make money doing that, but I like to have headcanon why this works. So you make that choice yourself. All right, so we've gone over why infantry weapons need to sound realistic, what are good choices for them. We have gone over battlesuits and mechs, and I'd like to go into a little bit of space combat. I could probably have its own separate video, but there's one thing about space combat you have to keep in mind as a writer. It's really hard to write in an entertaining way that sounds at all realistic. Because realistically, space combat is going to be boring as hell. Say it 200 years in the future, if we have any kind of military presence in space and there are ships that shoot at each other, which honestly I don't think is going to happen in real life. I think that manned ships that shoot at each other is not something that's going to happen because you can do this with drones, with unmanned ships, and there's going to be that's the realistic, boring war that's probably actually going to happen. But we're not writing realistic, boring war. We're writing entertaining military science fiction. So you're not going to want armed drones. You're also not going to want what really is going to be realistic space combat, because there's going to be a lot of missiles just flying around, unmanned, maybe artificially intelligent missiles that are basically ships flying themselves, trying to get close to something and kill it. But we don't want just realism. What we want is cool stuff with verisimilitude. So you have to come up with justifications why that's not going to happen. I mean, you can just have it out there. You can, and people do this. You can just say, oh, this is a warship, this is what it shoots, this is who we're fighting, and you just do it because people expect that, because that's what all military science fiction does. But I'm trying to tell you how to write science fiction that doesn't suck. And part of not sucking is not doing what everybody else does exactly the same way. Now, you can give the same effect as everybody else is giving. You can wind up with ships that are flying through space and shooting each other in battles reminiscent of World War II naval battles, because that's what people want to read. But if you make it sound real, if you make it so that people can read this without having to disengage their brains, then you've gone up a step. You've jumped a tier, and you're going to make it so that you're going to have more loyal readers. You're going to have people who appreciate that you tried. So what is important in these situations is the nature of your drive, the nature of your defenses. If you have some kind of a Alcubierre-style warp drive that allows you to warp space around your ship and move without expelling reaction mass, well, that's a defense shield too. And if you have a defense shield that can warp stuff around your ship, that's probably going to mean that people can't sit back and shoot missiles at you or lob rocks at you, which is the other most boring weapon idea in the freaking universe, is to sit back from millions of kilometers away and lob rocks at somebody. That's boring. I know it's real, but when I see a science fiction book, military science fiction book, that is based on the idea of lobbing rocks at each other, I'm like, yeah, it's real, but why the hell would I want to read this? Unless you make everything else around it so utterly interesting, and this part is just like a side thing that's not important. Well, this isn't exciting. This isn't visualizable in a way that makes it cool. The Expanse managed to make it cool by adding another layer to it. They didn't just lob rocks at each other. They put stealth material over the rocks, which made it cool because you didn't know it was coming. You couldn't see anything. There was no defense against it. And that made it cool. But if you have this kind of a defense shield for this kind of a drive, then you can't do that boring thing where you lob stuff at each other from millions of kilometers away. So you have to get close. And if you have to get close, then you have cinematic starship battles. And that's what you're aiming for, because that's what people want to read about. They don't want to read about somebody waiting hours for a missile to reach them. That is going to be very, very hard to make it exciting. If you want a cinematic starship battle, something that resembles a pre-World War II naval battle, which is the goal, then you have to come up with a technological reason why people who can travel between the stars are having a pre-World War II naval battle. Yes, it sounds ludicrous, but you can make it sound totally reasonable. In Duty on Our Planet, that trilogy, they were using this warp-style drive. The only way, at first, when they hadn't fought anybody who had the same type of drive before. When they did, the only thing they could think of to fight them was to bounce their shield off the other person's shield, basically ram their ship at the right angle to cause damage to the other person's field and not their own. So, and then once you've disabled them, if you were ready for it and they weren't, you can get your field back up first and shoot them before they can get theirs up. That's a lot of drama, because the field intersects do damage on the ship. They can hurt people and kill people, and you have to do it. It's the only way you can do it. That's drama. That's exciting to read about. That's what you can do by manipulating your technology to make it dramatic. Also, like in the Birthright universe, they have a transition drive that allows small ships to jump in and out of transition space as long as they're not in a powerful gravity well. And if you're out in space and there's the enemy, you don't just keep flying towards each other really, really slow and start shooting millions of kilometers away. No, you jump and they jump and you shoot at each other briefly, and then you jump back out and you jump back in, you shoot each other again. It's all close range, it's fast paced, it's small ships, it's dramatic, it's exciting. That's what should be your goal. And your technology should serve the goal of having dramatic combat. Don't come up with the technology first and then try to figure a way to make it dramatic. I mean, this is just my opinion. You can do whatever you want, obviously. You're the writer. But in my opinion, you come up with the drama first and you change your technology to make it fit the drama. Because the drama, the conflict, that's the story. That's what your readers want to read about. You need to find a way to make the conflict have verisimilitude, have a patina of realism, which may or may not be realistic. It doesn't have to be realistic. It doesn't have to be practical. It has to feel practical. Come up with a way, either something somebody suggested or just something you came up with out of your head. It doesn't matter. For your ships to be propelled in a way that sounds real and yet will allow dramatic ship-to-ship combat. If ship-to-ship combat is your goal, if you're dealing solely with your space marines and nobody's going to be up in the ship, it really doesn't matter what you do. As long as you can get those marines to the ground, your ship combat can be boring if you want. It can be like a thing somebody mentions, like, man, I'm glad I'm a marine. I wouldn't want to be a fleet guy and have to wait hours for my shot to hit home. But if you're going to be writing any kind of style of fleet combat, then you have to come up with a good reason why it works that way, and a realistic sounding reason. And a lot of authors don't bother to do that, and I think it's detrimental. I don't know for other people. I can only speak for myself. But when I read either of those extremes, when I read a book that they have boring, realistic combat, or where they have totally unrealistic combat, like Star Wars, and don't bother to explain why it has to be that way, it takes me out of the story. The story may be great, it may feel exciting otherwise, but it puts something between me and the story. It demands a level of I can't remember the word, but where you have to accept something you know is not real, and if the story's not quite good enough for that, it might have been a really pretty good story that would have drawn me in otherwise, but it's just asking for too much. When you don't give a reason, it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't have to be realistic. It's not something I expect to hold up if you check it, with a physicist. It's just something you can keep in your mind. Like an actor who's asked for a motivation from a director. It's not something the audience will ever know. It's something he can keep in his mind so he knows how to act. Well, it's the same thing with a science fiction novel. It doesn't have to be something that would hold up, with a physicist examining it. Just something the reader can keep in their mind. That's the reason this works the way it works. Okay, I've gone on pretty long. There are a lot of resources out there. Go online. Atomic Rockets, the one I told you about last time, projectrho.com, has lots of resources about space weapons. So if you want to dig into this deeper, you can look at that. And as always, if you would like to contact me, dutyhonorplanet487@gmail.com is my email. rickpartlow.com is my website. facebook.com/dutyhonorplanet, my Facebook page. Feel free to contact me. Feel free to comment on the videos. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends. And I will talk to you next time.